My name is Rosie. I am 29 years old, and my grandfather's funeral felt more like a cold, corporate transaction than a farewell. The air in the lawyer's office was thick with a greed so palpable I could almost taste it, a bitter tang undercutting the faint scent of old books and lemon polish. It was a smell that should have been comforting, the smell of Grandpa's own study. But here, in this sterile legal space, it felt like a ghost haunting the wrong house. I felt a wave of nausea, not from grief, but from the sheer, unvarnished avarice that had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. I kept my eyes fixed on the worn pattern of the Persian rug, tracing its intricate, endless loops, trying to anchor myself in something solid, something that wouldn't morph into a dollar sign. My aunts and uncles sat perched on the edges of their plush chairs, their mourning clothes looking more like a uniform for this specific battle. The black wool and somber silks were not a tribute to the man we had just laid to rest. They were a costume for this, the main event. I watched my Aunt Carol subtly adjust the string of pearls at her neck, her fingers not stroking them in remembrance, but rather checking their worth, her mind already calculating how they would pair with the diamond bracelet she was undoubtedly expecting. Her husband, my Uncle David, had his ankle propped on his knee, and I could see the highly polished loafer bouncing with a nervous, excited energy. They were like racehorses penned in the starting gate, muscles coiled, waiting for the bell. They barely contained their glee as the lawyer began calling names, each one met with a satisfied smile or a quiet, calculating nod. Every time the lawyer cleared his throat, a hush would fall, so absolute you could hear the soft rustle of expensive fabric as they leaned forward, a flock of vultures eyeing a feast. My cousins received thick envelopes, each containing a check for $50,000. I saw Jessica, barely 22, her eyes widening as she peeked inside. She didn't look sad. She looked victorious, her freshly manicured nails, a tasteful, mournful nude, tapping against the cream-colored paper. That money represented a year of freedom in her mind, a down payment on an apartment away from her parents, a new wardrobe for the club she loved. Next to her, Mark, ever the brooding intellectual, gave a tight, approving nod, already mentally allocating it to his graduate school fund or perhaps that vintage motorcycle he was always talking about. They were nice kids, really, but in this room, on this day, they were just smaller versions of their parents, their grief neatly compartmentalized and shelved away in favor of this sudden, life-altering capital. My brother, the golden boy, got one for $100,000.
Of course he did.
Ethan, who had always known exactly what to say, when to show up with a bottle of Grandpa's favorite scotch, when to ask a question about stocks. His inheritance was a validation of a performance I had never learned to give. He didn't flinch, didn't even seem surprised. He simply accepted the envelope with a sober, grateful nod, as if he were receiving a well-earned bonus. I saw the faintest ghost of a smile play on his lips before he suppressed it, and in that unguarded moment, I felt a pang of something sharper than jealousy. It was a profound sense of alienation. He was part of this world, this ritual of exchange. I was merely an observer, a spectator in my own family. The real prizes came next. Deeds to beach houses, portfolios of stocks, ownership of lucrative rental properties, all divvied up between my parents' generation, totaling millions. This was when the masks truly slipped. My mother, sitting beside me, had her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. She wasn't looking at the lawyer. She was looking at her siblings, her expression a complex tapestry of anxiety and a desperate hope that she wouldn't be shortchanged. My father had placed a reassuring hand on her arm, but his gaze was fixed ahead, stoic and unreadable. When Aunt Carol was handed the deed to the Florida condo, she actually let out a small, choked sound, halfway between a cough and a sob of pure joy. She immediately began whispering to her daughter about Thanksgiving there, about the sun and the sea, her voice a frantic, happy buzz. The room hummed with their whispered celebrations, plans for European vacations, and new sports cars already taking flight. It was a symphony of future happiness, paid for with the life of a man who had, in his final years, found more solace in the quiet company of his granddaughter and his junk than in any of their carefully orchestrated visits. I could hear snippets, the Amalfi Coast, a Tesla, I think. Finally, add the sunroom. Their voices overlapped, a discordant chorus that drowned out any last whisper of sorrow. The funeral had been a formality. This was the resurrection, their rebirth into a life of greater luxury, all courtesy of the departed. I sat there, my black dress feeling too tight, the synthetic blend suddenly itchy and suffocating against my skin. It was a cheap dress bought in a hurry for this occasion, and in that moment, it felt like a symbol of everything I was and everything I was not. I was the one who worked a job I liked but didn't love, who lived in a small apartment filled with second-hand furniture I'd lovingly restored, who valued time over money. In this room, those qualities felt like failures. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach, a cold, hard ball of lead. They had all received their validation, their tangible proof of worth in the family ledger. What was left for me? What could possibly be left after the millions had been distributed? I was the last name on the list, the afterthought. I kept my eyes down, focusing on a single loose thread on the hem of my dress, waiting for my name to be called, for the final, gentle letdown that would confirm my place in this family's hierarchy. I was preparing for my own, quiet execution. Finally, the lawyer's voice cut through the celebratory buzz, a sharp, precise instrument slicing through the warm, thick air of their mutual congratulation. Rosie. The sound of my own name was like a splash of cold water. For a fleeting, foolish second, a spark of something, hope, maybe, or just a desperate need for validation, ignited in my chest. It was extinguished instantly by the weight of their collective gaze. All eyes briefly flicked to me as I walked to the front. It wasn't a look of interest or shared anticipation. It was the cursory, almost obligatory attention one gives to the final act of a play, the scene that must be endured before the real life of the audience can resume. I felt their stares like physical touches, my Aunt Carol's arched eyebrow, my cousin Jessica's poorly disguised smirk. The journey from my chair to the lawyer's desk felt like a mile-long walk of shame, my sensible black flats making no sound on the dense carpet, each step amplifying the frantic beating of my heart. He didn't reach for a thick, promising envelope. Instead, his hand emerged from behind the desk holding two small, insignificant objects. He placed them in my palm, a small, tarnished key, cold against my skin, and a single, yellowed envelope. The key was heavier than it looked, not with physical weight, but with the burden of its own shabbiness. It was small, the kind for a diary or an old trunk, its brass darkened and pitted with age, one tooth slightly bent. The envelope was thin, crackly, and seemed to suck the warmth from my hand. The contrast between the heavy, cream-colored stock of the checks and deeds and this flimsy, ancient paper was a cruelty in itself. The silence was deafening, a vacuum that lasted only a heartbeat, but in that heartbeat, I absorbed the full spectrum of their reactions. I saw the confusion on a few faces, the dawning comprehension on others, and then the inevitable. It was quickly filled with poorly concealed snickers. A sharp, nasal chuckle from my right. Uncle David, no doubt. A soft, girlish giggle from the corner where my cousin sat, hastily covered by a cough. The sounds were like tiny, sharp needles pricking every inch of my exposed skin. I could feel my face flush with heat, a burning wave of humiliation that started at my collarbone and swept up my neck, setting my cheeks on fire. I was a spectacle. The poor, forgotten granddaughter. The one Grandpa had clearly deemed unworthy of a real inheritance. My eyes, stinging with unshed tears, instinctively sought refuge, landing on my mother. But she looked away, her expression one of pure pity. That was the worst of it. The snickers I could weather, the open mockery I could defiantly ignore, but my mother's pity was a knife to the heart. It was an affirmation of my failure. In her averted gaze and pained grimace, I read her own embarrassment, her disappointment that her daughter had been so publicly, so peculiarly slighted. She couldn't even look at me, as if my shame was somehow contagious. I retreated to my chair, my legs moving on autopilot, numb and unfeeling. The room's noise, which had momentarily stilled, rushed back in a wave, louder and more vibrant than before. My humiliation was already old news. I collapsed into the plush upholstery, my body feeling both heavy and hollow. My fist was clenched so tightly around the two objects that the key was digging into my flesh, its irregular shape and cold metal a painful brand in the center of my palm. It was the only real sensation in a world that had suddenly become soft-focused and surreal. I could smell the faint, metallic scent of the old key, a smell of dust and forgotten corners, a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes and expensive colognes filling the room. Slowly, as if handling a live explosive, I pried my other hand open and placed the key carefully on my black-clad thigh. It left a small, red indentation in my palm. My focus turned to the envelope. It felt fragile, as if it might crumble to dust between my fingers. My name was written on the front in that familiar, looping script, a script I associated with birthday cards with $5 bills, with lists of items he wanted me to research for him. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, caged bird trying to escape the prison of my chest. I was afraid of what it might say. An apology? A final, cryptic piece of advice to make up for the lack of a real inheritance? With trembling fingers, I broke the brittle seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was unmistakably his, a little shakier than in his prime, but still full of character. For my granddaughter, who actually listened. The one who sees value where others see junk. Check the place we had our best conversations. I read it once, then again, and a third time. The words blurred as tears of confusion and a sharp, stinging hurt welled in my eyes. They were not tears of grief for my grandfather, but for myself. For the crushing disappointment. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a riddle. A poetic, sentimental, and utterly useless riddle. The one who sees value where others see junk. It felt like a cruel taunt. Was this his way of saying his junk was now my junk? That because I'd humored him, I was now the proud owner of his so-called collection? The key in my lap felt like a symbol of this burden, a responsibility no one else had wanted, now dumped unceremoniously into my lap. Around me, my family had already moved on, their windfalls making me invisible. The brief, painful spotlight had shifted, and I was once again in the shadows. My uncle was clapping my brother on the back. My aunts were comparing the locations of their new properties, their voices a cheerful, buzzing hum that completely excluded me. I was an afterthought, the punchline to a joke I didn't understand. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the note clutched in one hand, the key burning a hole in the other, surrounded by the vibrant, bustling evidence of my own irrelevance. The man I had loved most in the world, the man whose quiet company I had genuinely cherished, had, in his final act, left me feeling more alone and misunderstood than I ever had in my entire life. I drove home in a daze, the world outside my car windows blurring into a smear of indifferent streetlights and passing headlights. The two objects on the passenger seat seemed to radiate a cold energy. The rusty key and cryptic note sat there like an accusation, a silent testament to my naivety. Each time I glanced at them, a fresh wave of heat washed over me. I felt foolish and humiliated, the echoes of my family's snickers seeming to bounce around the interior of my car, trapped with me. I had sat through that entire reading, through the distribution of life-changing wealth, with a secret, fragile hope that my grandfather had seen me, truly seen me, and that his recognition would be something profound. Instead, I had been given a prop from a pirate movie and a line from a fortune cookie. The key itself was an insult. It was the physical manifestation of being an afterthought. It wasn't even a key to something grand like a safe deposit box. It was a common, cheap key, the kind you copy for a few dollars, now tarnished and slightly bent. It felt like a metaphor for my place in the family, a little damaged, a little tarnished, and not quite fitting the lock of their world. The note, with its poetic sentiment, felt like a weak consolation prize, a pat on the head for being the good listener. A good listener gets a pat on the head. Everyone else gets a beach house. The injustice of it was a bitter pill I couldn't swallow, its taste coating my tongue all the way home. My apartment was dark and silent, a stark contrast to the overheated, noisy opulence of the lawyer's office. I didn't turn on the lights. I let the darkness envelop me, its cool anonymity a balm on my burned pride. I dropped my purse and keys on the floor by the door and slid down the back of it, sitting on the cool hardwood, pulling my knees to my chest. In the profound quiet, the events of the day replayed on a frantic, cruel loop. The look on my mother's face, the sound of my uncle's chuckle, the weight of that key. I took the note out of my pocket, the paper crackling unnaturally loud in the stillness. I couldn't see it in the dark, but I didn't need to. The words were seared onto my memory. For my granddaughter, who actually listened, the one who sees value where others see junk. Check the place we had our best conversations. Tears of self-pity welled up again. Listened. I had listened. I had listened for years, while he showed me broken tools and dusty old signs. I had listened while everyone else was at brunch or shopping. And for my listening, I was now the curator of his junk. The family's narrative was writing itself in my head. Poor Rosie, she was always a bit strange, too sentimental, and now she's stuck with all of Dad's clutter. At least it's out of her hair. The thought was unbearable. I sat there for what felt like hours, the numbness of the drive home slowly giving way to a churning, sickening hurt. It was a hurt directed not just at my family, but at my grandfather. How could he? How could he have set me up for this? He knew what they were like. He knew I would be the target of their ridicule. Was this some final, strange test? Or was it, as I feared, simply that he saw me as the receptacle for the things no one else wanted, just as I had been the receptacle for his stories? It was only later that night, sitting in the dark of my apartment, the city's ambient light casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor, that the note's meaning clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a gradual dawning. It was a sudden, violent realignment of my reality. The phrase, "the place we had our best conversations," echoed, and this time, it didn't sound like a sentimental cliché. It sounded like a specific, deliberate address. The storage unit. The realization was so simple, so obvious, that it stole the air from my lungs. Of course, it wasn't his house, which was always filled with the chatter of family. It wasn't a park or a restaurant. It was Unit 114 at the A1 Secure Storage on Elm Street. Every Sunday for years, while the rest of the family rolled their eyes and made jokes about his hoarding, I'd meet Grandpa there. It was our ritual, our sanctuary. He'd have a couple of folding chairs and an old cooler with 2 sodas in it. He'd show me his latest finds, antique hand planes whose worn wooden handles told stories of 100 different projects, rusted but beautiful neon signs for defunct soda pops that held the ghost of a vibrant past, vintage toys with chipped paint that spoke of childhoods long since faded. He wouldn't just show them to me. He'd tell me their stories, not just of the objects themselves, but of the eras they came from, the hands that had made them, the people who had used them. He'd talk about history and craftsmanship, about the soul of a thing, and I'd listen. Not out of duty, but with genuine fascination. I saw the beauty he saw. I saw the value. And he had known it. The note wasn't a consolation prize, it was a map. The key wasn't an insult, it was a summons. A frantic energy seized me. The humiliation I had felt hours before was now replaced by a burning, urgent curiosity. I couldn't wait until morning. The need to know, to see, was too overwhelming. I grabbed my car keys, the tarnished key clutched tightly in my other hand, and I flew out of my apartment. I drove to the facility at midnight, the streets nearly empty, my mind racing faster than the engine. What had I been thinking? That he'd left me a stack of old newspapers? The note proved he knew exactly what he was doing. He was speaking to me in a language only I would understand, a language of shared passion and quiet understanding that was completely foreign to the rest of our family. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the lock of the main gate, and then later into the padlock of Unit 114. The metal scraped and protested, my trembling making the simple task feel Herculean. The familiar groan of the rolling door echoed in the silent, cavernous building, a sound that was the very soundtrack of my Sundays with him. It was a sound that usually promised an afternoon of discovery and companionship. Now it felt like the opening of a tomb, one that held either my final vindication or my ultimate heartbreak. I took a deep breath, the air smelling of dust, concrete, and old metal, and I pulled the door all the way up. When the motion-sensitive light flickered on, buzzing to life with a pale, jaundiced glow, it did not illuminate a jumble of junk. It illuminated a treasure trove. The unit was packed, floor to ceiling, not with the chaotic mess my family had always described, but with a meticulously preserved collection. Everything was organized, sorted, and cared for. There, in the center, was the porcelain service station sign of a winged horse we'd found at a flea market 5 years ago, now cleaned and gleaming under the weak light. Next to it, the complete set of vintage Samsonite luggage we'd admired. The shelves he had built were lined with the antique tools, each one oiled, and resting on a clean cloth. The vintage toy cars were arranged in a perfect grid. The rusted signs were stacked neatly against the wall, their vibrant colors peeking out from under the grime, just as we had found them. Everything we had ever admired together, every piece we had spent a Sunday afternoon discussing, was there. He hadn't just been collecting, he had been curating. And he had been curating it for me. It took me 3 full days and the hiring of 2 specialized appraisers to properly catalog it all. Those 3 days were a blur of dust motes dancing in the slanted light of the storage unit, of the sharp, clean scent of professional cotton gloves and the low, murmured jargon of the experts. Patina, Art Deco, First Edition, Mint Condition. The initial awe of my midnight discovery had given way to a methodical, almost sacred, process of revelation. I was not merely unpacking boxes. I was unwrapping layers of my grandfather's life, of our shared history, each item a tangible memory. We unearthed treasures that made the appraisers, 2 older gentlemen named Mr. Davies and Mr. Chin, exchange looks of growing disbelief. It started with the Tiffany lamps. I had always loved them, their dragonfly wing shades and intricate bronze bases sitting in a corner, unlit. Grandpa had told me they were good quality fakes. Mr. Davies, his voice hushed, informed me they were not only authentic, but from a particularly desirable period, their value astronomical. Then came the collection of pristine 1950s advertising signs for sodas, motor oil, and cigarettes, their colors vibrant, their metal barely scratched. My grandfather and I had spent a whole Sunday carefully cleaning one with a specific solution he'd researched, not to restore it to newness, but to preserve its authentic, aged glory. Mr. Chin called them a time capsule in tin. Next were the rare automotive memorabilia, a full set of porcelain hood ornaments from cars that no longer existed, their sleek, silver forms cool to the touch, and a stack of original, rolled factory blueprints that made Mr. Davies whistle softly. And finally, the set of antique tools that a museum would covet. They were the tools he had taught me to name, to hold, to respect. The hand-forged planes, the brass-bound levels, the saws with handles worn smooth by the grip of generations of craftsmen. I had held these very tools in my own inexperienced hands, feeling the ghost of those who had used them before me. To the appraisers, they were a priceless collection of 19th-century craftsmanship. To me, they were the sound of my grandfather's voice, patient and proud. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the final box was catalogued. The unit, once a mysterious cave of wonders, was now a neatly organized archive, every item tagged, photographed, and noted. The air, which had been thick with the excitement of discovery, grew still and heavy with anticipation. Back in my apartment, surrounded by the familiar comfort of my own second-hand furniture, Mr. Davies sat down at my small kitchen table with a solemnity that made my heart stutter. His face was grave. This was it. The moment of truth. Would it be 100,000? Maybe 2? A sum that, while life-changing, would still feel like a fraction of what the others had received? I braced myself for a pleasant surprise, for a number that would soothe the sting of the funeral, but not erase it. "Rosie," he said, his voice low and steady, sliding a final document across the scarred wooden surface of my table. "The total auction value for this collection is approximately $4.7 million. The number hung in the air, unreal. It wasn't a number, it was an abstract concept, a seismic event that had not yet registered on my personal Richter scale. $4.7 million. It was more than any single one of my aunts or uncles had received. More than my brother and all my cousins combined. The air left my lungs in a soft whoosh. I stared at the figure on the paper, the digits swimming before my eyes. $4,700,000. The silence in my kitchen was absolute, broken only by the frantic thudding of my own pulse in my ears. And then the meaning of it crashed over me, not in terms of dollars, but in terms of intent. He hadn't given me junk. He'd given me his passion, our shared history, and he'd trusted me alone to see its true worth. While my family had been given liquid assets, easy money to be spent on fleeting pleasures, he had given me a legacy. He had entrusted me not with a check, but with a lifetime of careful, loving curation. He hadn't just left me wealth. He had left me the proof of his discernment, his eye for beauty, his soul. The rusty key wasn't a symbol of neglect. It was the key to his heart, and he had known that I, and only I, would know how to turn the lock. The cryptic note wasn't a dismissal. It was the final, beautiful lesson from a teacher to his only true student. The hurt and humiliation I had carried from the lawyer's office melted away, replaced by a profound, overwhelming understanding that was far more valuable than the money itself.
He had seen me. He had known me.
And he had honored me. The phone started ringing soon after. The news, it seemed, had trickled out. A whisper from Mr. Davies' assistant, a rumor from the storage facility manager. It didn't matter how. The grapevine of greed is a swift and efficient organism. The first call was from my Aunt Carol. Her voice was dripping with a newfound, syrupy sweetness I hadn't heard since I was a child, asking if I'd like to come over for dinner to catch up. My Uncle David called minutes later, his tone jovial, asking if I needed any financial advice from a seasoned pro. My cousin Jessica sent a flurry of texts, all exclamation points and emojis, suggesting a girls' weekend. My brother, Ethan, left a measured, careful voicemail, just checking in. But for the first time, I saw them with the same clarity my grandfather had. I heard the avarice beneath the sugary tones, the calculation behind the friendly words. They weren't calling Rosie, the granddaughter or niece. They were calling the $4.7 million. They were the same people who had snickered at a rusty key, who had pitted me, who had dismissed a lifetime of passion as worthless junk. Their sudden desire to reconnect was the most transparent and pathetic performance I had ever witnessed. I held the rusty key, which now felt warm and solid in my hand, no longer cold and accusing. It was no longer just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of the greatest inheritance of all, his belief in me. It was the key to my freedom, to my future, and to the unshakable knowledge that I had been loved and understood in a way none of them ever could be. And as the phone continued to ring, a small, calm smile touched my lips. I knew exactly which calls to ignore.